Good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where in the world you happen to be joining us from. I'm Steve Wernick, Reb Steve, Rabbi Wernick, one of the rabbis at Beth Congregation in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Conversations Over Coffee. I am thrilled to welcome my friend, Pastor Dani Dayan, to be my guest, who is currently the chairman of Yad Vashem of the Holocaust Museum in Yerushalayim. Dani previously served most recently as Israel's Consul General in New York from 2016 to 2020, which is where I got to know him. And previously, he was the chairman of the YESHA Council, and before that served as chairman of the board and CEO of Elad Software Systems, company that he founded. Dani, it is always a pleasure to see you. Welcome, Baruch haba.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you again, even if it's virtually.
Well, God willing, we'll be able to see each other in not so distant future in Israel or here in Toronto. I know that you're coming in May for our Weisfeld lecture, and we look forward to welcoming you to the community. And May is a good time to come to Toronto, certainly better than January or February. We'd have to buy you a new coat if you were coming now.
I just took a look in my iPhone. I saw that you have a very mild -2 or 3 Celsius. So don't complain so much.
I'm not well. The last couple of weeks it was -16 to 20. It was
I know.
It was brutally cold. There's a lot that I want to talk to you about, and so I'm glad you're coming to Toronto because we'll be able to continue the conversation. But let's start with the most relevant. Antisemitism is on a sharp rise. It has been for the last several years, in the last decade, and certainly in the last 5 years, it seems even more so. We're seeing it here in Canada as well. According to B'nai B'rith, which tracks anti-Semitism in Canada, this is the third year in a row that there's been more than 2,000 incidents. There's been a 44% increase of incidents in Ontario alone. The incidents are mostly harassment and vandalism in nature. Very little violence, unlike the violence that we've seen in the U.S. But we know it's a short hop, skip, and a jump from harassment to violence. The Jewish community around the world was stunned and feels impacted by the events in Colleyville, Texas. And then even here in Canada, Canadian Jews are reeling from recent events in which the trucker protests on the anti-vaccination regulations for cross-border travel went up to Ottawa. And one of the images that we saw was Nazi symbolism intertwined with the vaccination protests. From the perspective of Yad Vashem, how concerned should we be about this rise? Does it portend something new, something waiting on the horizon? How do you understand it from Yad Vashem in Yerushalayim?
Well, first of all, Rabbi, first from my personal perspective, when I arrived to New York, as you mentioned, in August 2016, I didn't expect anti-Semitism to be high in my agenda. I will even be brutally sincere and say that I believed at that time that anti-Semitism is frequently used by Jewish organizations to raise funds. But reality was completely different. It started gradually. I remember I went to Philadelphia, to the suburb of Philadelphia, to a desecrated Jewish cemetery, and then another one in Rochester, New York, and a swastika in a shul in Manhattan. And then came Charlottesville. Charlottesville was definitely a watershed moment, because to see the Nazi flag being waved proudly, I should say, in an American city was shocking for me. Something that in most countries, most European countries, and certainly in Israel, would be not only morally repugnant, but also criminally prohibited. But nothing prepared me for that Shabbat in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was part of my jurisdiction, and I arrived to Pittsburgh to Etz Chaim synagogue when the 11 bodies were still lying there in the shul. And then Poway, California, and a kosher grocery in Jersey City, New Jersey, and a Hanukkah celebration in Monsey, New York. 15 Jews murdered, not attacked, murdered in less than 2 years. That's something, when I heard once that in France, 11 Jews were murdered in a decade, I thought that's terrible. But here you have in the United States, 15 Jews murdered in 2 years. That's something terrible is happening. Now I will tell you, Rabbi Steve, now from Yad Vashem's perspective, what I tell the dignitaries that come to Yad Vashem. You know that every official visit to Israel by presidents, prime ministers, foreign affairs ministers include usually a visit to Yad Vashem. And I tell those dignitaries that have come the following, that we are not in Europe of the 30s now. Thank God there is a huge difference between these days, the world in 2022 and Europe of the 30s. But the difference is that we have what the world those days lacked, and that is experience. And we know to what monstrous dimensions anti-Semitism can develop if it's not confronted immediately when it starts. So I tell them, and I believe that's the right thing to tell them, that their obligation, not only the state of Israel, the Jewish communities, their obligation as world leaders is to confront anti-Semitism forcibly, decisively, before, when it starts, when the first signs are shown, and otherwise, if it happened once, developed into something horrific, it can happen again. Otherwise, if you don't do that, then never again is not something real, but a shallow cliche.
So I want to follow up on that. One of the reassuring things from the Western countries, anyway, is the immediacy in which there's condemnation of these acts, and messages of support for the Jewish community. What would you say are some of the tachlis policy issues that seem to still be lacking, that would have a positive impact in taking anti-Semitism and returning it to the margins?
Well, on the policy level, I would say, first of all, I don't underestimate the importance of condemnation. I definitely think is important, but condemnation should be done in such a way that really outcasts the perpetrators, that make them really out of the civilized society and that is done mainly through education. I think that education against anti-Semitism, which Holocaust on the Holocaust is part of it, but it's not limited to education regarding the Holocaust, is extremely important in that sense. I think that is not being done enough, and probably is not being done properly. And I wouldn't also underestimate the importance of law enforcement. I think that law enforcement here is in most countries is also lacking. The fact that Jewish communities have to raise the funds in many cases to defend themselves, to fortify their shuls and schools and community centers, that should be the task of authorities.
On the on the flip side, well, actually, before I get there, the role of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is something that has long been connected, certainly in the last several decades. We've seen in Canada the last Israel-Hamas war was really a turning point, it seems, in ratcheting up the volume and the anxiety and the tension. What do you think? What do you think's behind that, and how do we effectively address it?
Rabbi Steve, I will tell you what I noticed south of your border in New York, in eastern United States, when I served there. I identify, probably it's somewhat different in Canada, but it may come also to Canada. I detected 4 types of anti-Semitism, but what exacerbated the problem is that synergy existed between those different four type of different anti-Semitism. The first one was what they would call naked neo-Nazi, white supremacist anti-Semitism, like we saw in Charlottesville and to some extent in Pittsburgh. The historical neo-Nazi anti-Semitism. The second, and this is very unfortunate, there was in the US at least a kind of ideological African-American anti-Semitism, in some instances led by Louis Farrakhan from Nation of Islam. Also the perpetrators of assassination in the kosher grocery in Jersey City were what they call themselves Black Israelites, that they believe that we are impostors and they are the real Jews, and so it's kind of ideological African-American anti-Semitism. The third one I would say is hooliganism, anti-Semitic hooliganism, a guy that goes in the streets and sees a Jew with a Orthodox attire and attack him or shatters the window of a Jewish-owned shop. And the fourth that you mentioned is a thinly veiled anti-Zionism that disguises itself as anti-Zionism. And we see very clearly that each one feeds the others. There is a synergy between those, and motives that appear in the neo-Nazi anti-Semitism sometimes appear in the allegedly anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, and vice versa. And we have here powerful forces that feed each other and strengthen the anti-Semitism.
What role does Yad Vashem see itself playing in providing resources and combating those 4 types of anti-Semitism today?
Well, for many years, Yad Vashem was reluctant to deal with post-Holocaust anti-Semitism. Because if the mission of Yad Vashem is the Holocaust remembrance, then pre-Holocaust anti-Semitism has much to do with the Holocaust, but allegedly post-Holocaust anti-Semitism didn't influence retroactively the Holocaust. So it's not our business, excuse me for using this word in that context, to deal with post-Holocaust anti-Semitism. But I am just a few months in chairman of Yad Vashem. To me, is very.
And you haven't changed everything yet.
Yeah, I changed a lot of things, and we are definitely in the process of changing that. I think that it's very clear that in these days that's unsustainable. To refrain from dealing with modern anti-Semitism, with contemporary anti-Semitism, with post-Holocaust anti-Semitism is not sustainable. And definitely we are starting to do that, both on research and on education. Mainly on education, we released an online course on anti-Semitism that goes from early Christian anti-Semitism to modern right-wing and left-wing anti-Semitism. We are in the process of marketing it. Probably that's not the right word, but disseminating it. And we believe that Holocaust education is extremely powerful as a tool to combat anti-Semitism, and we have now to make that link. Probably in the past we refrained from doing that link. We should do it much more explicitly.
Even Holocaust education seems like it's becoming more and more difficult. I saw a statistic recently where 7 out of 10 young people, I don't remember if it was in Canada or the United States, but 7 out of 10 young people either have a doubt about the Holocaust, think perhaps the tragedy is exaggerated, or just not sure about it. It seems like the farther we get away from it, the more willing people are to I don't know what the word is, but you understand the question.
Yeah, I think that the larger problem that we have regarding Holocaust education or Holocaust awareness, if you want, if you like, Holocaust literacy, is ignorance. It's simply ignorance. People don't know about the Holocaust, don't know enough about the Holocaust. They know from unreliable sources. That's the reason that we believe that Holocaust education should be each country's, call it country, province, local authorities' responsibility. It's a very powerful tool against bigotry, against racism, and for sure against anti-Semitism. I believe that we are reaching out. I was also in New York and I met the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, and we agreed that the UN will also be part of that drive to strengthen Holocaust education all over the world. By the way, I also must say that, yes, among the general public, there is a lot of ignorance, and you can hear things like the Holocaust didn't happen and this and that, but I don't see Holocaust denial, outright Holocaust denial, as the main problem today. By the way, in the 90s, in the 80s, in the 90s, even in Canada, there were intellectuals that denied the occurrence of the Holocaust. That sees probably a great contribution for that was the strong verdict in the trial between the Holocaust denier David Irving and Deborah Lipstadt, Professor Deborah Lipstadt. That was really a knockout to Holocaust deniers. 3 visits by consecutive popes to Yad Vashem put an end probably to Catholic Holocaust denial, and also diplomatic initiatives like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA. You won't find today a world leader, an intellectual, a journalist, an influencer, probably except in Iran, that will say that the Holocaust didn't occur. But we see a very disturbing, 2 very disturbing phenomena, that is Holocaust distortion and Holocaust trivialization. The Holocaust trivialization was, we saw that in Ottawa the other day very clearly. That is Holocaust trivialization, because if the mandates of vaccines or masks are equal to the Holocaust, then the Holocaust was not so terrible. That is a terrible trivialization of the Holocaust. Distortion, by the way, is in many cases carried out by governments. Governments that say, of course, the Holocaust occurred, but in my country, each government says, mainly in Eastern Europe, but we see now even in other places, in my country, there were no collaborators in my country with Nazi Germany. And the fact is, of course, that in every single European country, there were much more collaborators with the Nazis than righteous among the nations, much more.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Denmark, for example, where you actually had the opposite. when there were more righteous amongst the nation than there were collaborators. The Jews.
But in most countries and even in Denmark there were collaborators. The only country in Europe that had more Jews at the beginning of the war than after that had more Jews after the war than before the war was Albania.
It was Albania.
A Muslim country. Yeah, that is remarkable.
Yeah. So that's very disturbing too. You look at countries like Poland that are creating these new laws. And then on the flip side, you look at the UEA, which is with the new Abraham Accords. They seem to be taking these lessons and actually running positively with them.
Definitely, no doubt about that. That's remarkable. Actually, I was invited to participate in a virtual event in Dubai, carried out by the Crossroads of Civilizations Museum in Dubai, honoring the Holocaust International Remembrance Day. The only reason I couldn't participate is that we have our own event at that same day and time. But that is definitely remarkable. We had in Yad Vashem visits by Emirates and people from Bahrain and from Morocco, and I hope that soon we'll have from other Arab countries, in addition, obviously, to Egypt and Jordan.
Right.
Yeah, that is remarkable in every aspect. As we speak, President Herzog is in the UAE. The development of the Abraham Accords, including in Holocaust awareness, is remarkable.
I want to give those that are watching us an opportunity to ask a question if they have one. Please feel free to type your question into the comment section of Facebook or into YouTube. And once we see those questions, they'll be forwarded to us and we'll ask them if there are any. Dani, I want to switch gears a little bit to a project that we worked on when we were together, and that you certainly were very supportive in helping the conservative and reform movements communicate with then Prime Minister Netanyahu on issues of religious pluralism in Israel, and the Kotel agreement that Natan Sharansky and the Jewish world completed with the government that was then tabled. It's very disappointing to see Prime Minister Bennett in the Jerusalem Post recently walk away from that after not only promising it, but having the implementation of the agreement be part of the coalition agreement itself. What are your thoughts on why we remain stuck in getting this done? And do you see a road, a pathway by which we might actually move forward when it comes to pluralism and the Kotel in particular?
I must, before I answer that question, I must say that, when I became chairman of Yad Vashem, I put a kind of virtual firewall between me and politics, but I don't consider this issue as a political issue. I consider it more a moral issue than a political issue. And it's I'm very sorry about the fact that the Kotel agreement is not being re-implemented or re-adopted by the government. I know that there is a huge support among the current government up to it, and I must admit that I expected it to adopt it or re-adopt it and to implement it. I remember, these days our Attorney General, I think it's tomorrow, his last day in office, Avichai Mandelblit, that he's the person virtue that in his previous position as cabinet secretary, he was the person that conducted the negotiations that bear fruit in as this agreement, or for the fact that he's an extremely orthodox individual. And I don't know if he would like me to disclose that, but I remember that before I left to New York, I had a conversation with him, a chat with him, and I asked him, Avichai, tell me what will happen if the government freezes or cancels that agreement. And I will never forget his answer. His answer was, Dani, if the Jewish people decides to commit suicide, I am not sure I can prevent it from doing that. So that he was very clear, and that it's a terrible thing to do, to freeze or to cancel, and now to not to re-implement that agreement. It's no secret that I had serious differences of opinion with the Prime Minister in this issue. Probably more than in any other issue, and probably that's the reason that at some point we ceased to be as close as we were. I see that definitely as something that political lobbying should be continued on this issue, because it's extremely important. And going back to my role now as Yad Vashem, it's regretful that politics divide us, religion divides us, and a source of some comfort, which shouldn't be that way, is that probably we should leverage this issue in which we have a common ground, which is Holocaust remembrance, to unify the Jewish people. And as much as that is viable, I intend to do that.
I think that's a good point, right? Our enemies don't differentiate between our politics or our religious positions, and they'll take the most secular amongst us and the most religious, and march us to the same end if they were allowed to do so.
No doubt. And it's very sad, but
it is, and we do need to continue to advocate and to lobby for that, and God willing, a change will come. We do have a question that comes from Fidel. She asks, what approaches can we suggest that would perhaps arouse curiosity on campus and in the general community to increase their Holocaust education?
Well, first of all, I will add before I suggest some solutions, I will add to the problem. We are approaching. I hope it will take many years until we get there, but unfortunately, for natural reasons, the number of survivors is dwindling, and we are approaching the era in which there will be no survivors alive. I hope it will take many years, but at some point it will happen. And when that happens, our mission will be much more difficult, much more challenging, but also much more important, much more vital. We will be in that case the witnesses. The documents will be the witnesses. That's the reason we are so in Yad Vashem. So I would use the word obsessed with collecting documents from all over the world, from archives in Russia and here and there, because the documents will be the witnesses. And I must also say, in that respect, let's not forget when we speak about that we will not be able to hear the witnesses themselves, the survivors themselves, that obviously 6 million Jews were never able to give testimony because they perished in the camps or in the shooting pits. But we will have to be innovative. Thank God, or I don't know who we should thank, but technology gives us ways in order to do that. That's one path in which we intend to march in the coming years, in the coming decade, to enhance our technological capability to do things. And regarding the campus, I think that, again, the Holocaust is a lesson for humanity that coincides with also with progressive causes, and we should raise as curiosity, as Friedel says, using that vocabulary, also that terminology.
Thank you, Dani. Clearly, this is a conversation of which there is much, much more to talk about. We look forward to welcoming you to Bet Tzedek and to Toronto in May, God willing, in person, as well as live streamed, to continue this conversation about Yad Vashem and Holocaust education. It's really good to see you. Again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It has been both an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you, Dani.
Thank you, Rabbi.